and welcome to Old Books with Grace. I'm Dr. Grace Hammond.
And I'm Marisa Tualla.
Marisa is my special guest here for this third installment of the Summer Old Book Club series with Jane Austen's Persuasion. I'm so excited you're here today in person. All the way from Phoenix, Arizona. So I'm thrilled that Marisa could be here with me today, right here sitting next to me, which is so fun.
So fun.
I have to introduce Marisa to you guys. Marisa and I met in college at the University of Arizona, Bear Down Wildcats.
Bear Down.
In 2006. So that was quite a long time ago now.
It's a very long time ago.
We were housemates for 2 years in college and became close friends. And she was actually one of my bridesmaids, which was a decade ago.
Oh, gosh.
Also a long time ago. Marisa's a proud Arizonan,
yes,
like myself.
Mm-hmm.
She taught math to middle schoolers for many years in Arizona before teaching math overseas in Shanghai and in Portugal. She's now a math curriculum specialist for a school district in Phoenix, and she received her master's in education from Grand Canyon University only a few weeks ago. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much.
Marisa is curious. She's really fun. She's truly faithful. And she's present in the lives of people she loves. She loves to travel, and she's actually been to around 40 countries, which is so cool and so ridiculous.
And not enough.
She's constantly on the rampage for the next country. Mm-hmm. So, yes. And she's also the person I turn to for fashion advice. And my favorite person with whom to watch movies, especially in the theater. We've been doing that for a long time.
Yes. And every time we're together, we make sure to watch a movie.
Yes. So I am really excited you're here, Mark.
Me too. My very first podcast.
Yes. To discuss with me chapters 7 through 9 of volume 1 of Persuasion. But first, of course, I have to ask you your questions.
All right. Let me just say, I'm very excited to be here. I was so excited when Grace asked me to do this because we always talk about books and she's so wise. So I'm hoping I can add something to this podcast today.
Thanks, Tamar. So, question number 1. Mm-hmm. What is your favorite author or book from more than 50 years ago?
So I have 2 answers for that now. Okay. My first one that I came up with was Jane Eyre.
Ooh,
my mom loved that book, and I tried it a long time ago. In the very beginning, when she's a kid and there's this weird ghost scene, I was kind of
the red room.
Yes, I was like not into it, and I stopped.
Yes,
so I tried it a second time, skipped that part, and then I loved it, and I couldn't put it down. And then recently, I realized I also love Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, that I love Sherlock Holmes.
Starting with like The Great Mouse Detective when we were kids.
Disney's version.
I saw like all the movies and the TV shows, and then I finally read the book after the BBC Sherlock version because they're very close to the books. The stories are.
Yes.
And then I read them and I was like, oh, these are so cool.
They're really fun. And I highly recommend, by the way, if any of you are looking for a summer read that's really fun, actually Sherlock Holmes would be a great choice.
And they're not too long either.
So you can just like sit down, read one in an evening with a glass of wine or a cup of tea.
Yep.
It's very, very pleasant.
Yep. So those are my answers.
All right. Question number 2.
Mm-hmm.
Which literary character do you most identify with and why?
So I texted Grace a lot because I really had a hard time with this one. And I listened to the other episodes, and I'm not the only one, it seems like, that struggles to answer this question. I think it's the hardest
question. I really do.
Maybe it's just like, maybe you can see other people as characters, but it's harder to like know yourself that well.
I think that's very true.
So I had years ago asked Grace which Jane Austen character would I be, and you gave me both Marianne and Eleanor from Sense and Sensibility because I'm a mix of rational and emotional.
I still think that's
very true. And then we were texting, and then Grace said an answer that I really liked, and it's here on my phone. She said one option could be Samwise Gamgee from Lord of the Rings, because I love home, but I'm an intrepid traveler, brave, people-oriented, loyal, and kind. So Grace said it, so it sounds humble when I say it. So I'm going to go with those.
I think that you're a really good Samwise Gamgee. I feel really good about my answer. I think it works.
I'm just not as good as a cook as Sam is.
Oh, yeah. I know. Potatoes. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew. I know. As you might be able to see if you're watching the YouTube version, I have a Hobbit cover framed above my kitchen table. So I am a kind of a mega Lord of the Rings fan, except not the Hobbit movies, which were absolutely wretched. So that's a side note. But anyways,
Side note.
Question number 3. When was the first time you read a Jane Austen novel, and what did you think at the time?
So it was my senior year of high school. I was in AP English, which kind of was a surprise for me because I was not a reader. I was more of a math person in school.
Math curriculum specialist, future math curriculum specialist.
So my dad, who taught at my high school, said I should take AP because it's Mr. Mangan, and Mr. Mangan is the best English teacher. And I was like, all right, cool. We read Pride and Prejudice as our first book in the curriculum, and he taught it in such a way that I could understand what was happening. And I wanted to read ahead, which I'd never done that in English class before. I sometimes just read Spark Notes and then didn't finish the book. But in this class, I read every single book, even if I didn't like it. And he was such a good inspiration for me to enjoy literature, even if I don't like the story or the characters. So I loved Pride and Prejudice. And that year, I think also the movie came out with Keira Knightley.
2005. That was the Keira Knightley movie.
Yeah. So my love for Pride and Prejudice just like bloomed.
Yes. Oh,
and then I was a Jane Austen fan from there.
I love that.
Yeah. So thanks, Mr. Mangan.
Way to go, Mr. Mangan.
Shout out to all the teachers.
Yes. Thank you to all the teachers. Should we get to Persuasion?
All right. Let me get my notes on my phone because that's how I do it. Shall we begin?
Yes. I would like to begin with, so if we can reorient ourselves. Captain Wentworth has just come to the Musgroves, and they have heard of him. They just remembered that he was the captain of poor Dick Musgrove.
That's right.
And so they're very eager to meet him. And Anne is kind of horrified by this turn of events where she's thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to be around him all the time. Yeah. This is going to be really hard.
This is what I've been waiting for.
Yes. And we begin chapter 7 with this line. A few days more, and Captain Wentworth was known to be at Kellynch, and Mr. Musgrove had called on him and come back warm in his praise, and he was engaged with the Crofts to dine at Uppercross by the end of another week. And the reason why I like this beginning is that it's so subtle. It sounds just like a basic informative sentence, but in classic Jane Austen form, we have these like little undercurrents, these little themes where it's not just like, oh, Captain Wentworth arrived at Kellynch and Mr. Musgrove called on him. We have this phrase that I am clearly like kind of obsessed with that we've been following in previous podcasts where it's known. Who's known? What does it mean to be known?
Oh.
What's the significance of like what kinds of knowledge matter? How do we truly know each other? So there's this little hint here where Jane Austen begins this chapter with Captain Wentworth was known to be at Kellynch. Not that, and she didn't have to say it that way, but she did.
Oh.
It's a little, I think, a little nod to these themes.
I love that.
Yes. So everyone is eager to know him because he is a person worth knowing now.
Ah, yes. Another known drop right there.
Yes. So there he is. And what did you make of this beginning, Mar?
Well, I was really excited. I've been in anticipation for a long time for Anne and Captain Wentworth to reunite because that's what it's all about is them getting together again. The beginning I was a lot of focused on, I know, with Mary and her kids. And I thought in the other Jane Austen books, I've read or watched the movies of, kids are not usually a big part of the story.
Oh, this is a really interesting point. Yes.
But now, like, there's a lot of kids that have been a big part of the story.
Yes. So what do you think, like, when you encounter that, what do you make of that? What do you think that the significance of that is? Because I you're right. They're not really around except as like weird background props,
Yes.
you know,
like barely mentioned.
Like in Sense and Sensibility, you have the really insipid woman that's married to their cousin John, who are hosting them. I'm forgetting her name, but all she can talk about are her children.
Yeah.
And that's like the sole focus. And for Jane Austen, that was always kind of a tagline. It was like, women who could only talk about their children, not a good thing in Jane Austen. Like you really need to level up your conversation game.
Definitely.
But so this is really interesting that children appear so prominently in this section.
Yeah, and just parenting in general. We're seeing people parent their kids in this book. Well, mainly Mary and her husband.
Yes.
And the lack of parenting. Really.
Well, and really parenting.
and Anne being the parent and the caregiver and all that.
I really thought that is interesting that all of this, chapters 7 through 9, all of this is viewed through this lens of like the backdrop of this whole storyline in this section is little Charles and his injuries.
Yes.
Like he provides the like reasons for all the action in this whole section, which is fascinating. And you're right, unlike Jane Austen. So why do you think she would do that? What does it mean?
That's a great question, Grace. I just was thinking about parenting, and there's a few lines in there about a few quotes that I pulled. When Charles was sick and he was injured, and they were trying to figure out like who's going to take care of him, who's going to watch them. And the husband, what's his name again?
Charles. There's
Charles.
Big Charles and little Charles.
Big Charles goes, what was there for a father to do? That was quite a female case. And then he also says, nursing does not belong to a man. A sick child is always the mother's property. So there's a lot of things like that with I'm in a modern lens being like, okay, so we're talking about gender roles also between these parenting examples as well. So I don't know if Jane is pointing out the differences because it's wrong, like men should be involved with their kids when they're hurt and it's not a woman's thing, or if she's just pointing out that's just society.
Well, I think when I read that, I think you're right. Like, I think she's not cool with it.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I don't know how much to say, like, Austen is saying it should be a man's role to be in the sick room, or, but she's definitely saying, hey, there's something deficient here in the kind of love and attention that Charles and Mary offer little Charles, right? And so, and this is true of other Musgroves as well. So I noticed like there's the initial fall. So if you haven't read it for a few days, or if you're still catching up, what happens is that little Charles Musgrove, and I don't think we know how old he is, but I'm assuming around like 4 or 5, because the littler one is 2. That is mentioned. He falls and he hits his head very badly, and his collarbone was dislocated and he hit his spine. And so that's what they're really worried about, is that this could be actually a very serious injury. It's not one of those like
it's not like I have a old cut
book,
on my knee.
Yeah, or like when I was a kid reading old books, I was always like, they're also worried about catching colds from like wet clothes, and that seemed so weird to me. Which obviously, like, I now realize that it was because a cold could turn into something so much more severe. But what I'm saying is that this isn't in that category. Like, this is legit. This is scary. This is potentially a devastating injury, and they aren't sure yet.
Yeah, this would be like you rushing your kid to the emergency room being like, the wife needs to take care of it.
Yes. And so the doctor comes, examines them, and then the 2 Miss Musgroves, Louisa and Henrietta, come, and Captain Wentworth had been at dinner at their house, and because of little Charles's injury, none of the people at the cottage could come to dinner and meet him. So the aunts come over, and the older Musgroves as well, but Louisa and Henrietta stay a little bit longer, stay 5 minutes behind their father and mother to endeavor to express how perfectly delighted they were with Captain Wentworth, how much handsomer, how infinitely more agreeable than they thought him than any individual among their male acquaintance who had been at all a favorite before. How glad they had been to hear Papa invite him to stay to dinner. How sorry when he said it was quite out of his power, and how glad again when he had promised to reply to Papa and Mama's farther pressing invitations to come and dine with them on the morrow. Actually, on the morrow. And he had promised it in so pleasant a manner, as if he felt all the motive of their attention just as he ought. And in short, he had looked and said everything with such exquisite grace that they could assure them all their heads were both turned by him, and off they ran, quite as full of glee as of love, and apparently more full of Captain Wentworth than of little Charles. Yeah. So this is quite the revealing statement, where in this same paragraph of describing the physician soothing the frightened parents and Anne, we have this gushing of praise about Captain Wentworth by Louisa and Henrietta.
Yeah, I would love a compliment like that.
And we see how this family, while we really like the Musgroves and they're a great family, and in the last chapter we saw how they were such a better model of family love and attention towards one another than the Elliots, but here we really see their shortcomings and their failures to like really attend to one another.
Yeah, and their priorities kind of always go with their what they need and their desires. So you talk about like they were meaning to meet Captain Wentworth, and is that the same time where Charles and Mary trying to figure out who would go?
Yes, so
to
this
dinner?
is the morrow.
Okay,
then.
this is the morrow.
On the morrow. Actually, on the morrow.
Let's talk about that all the time, please. Let's talk about on the morrow.
On the morrow. So, yes. So at first, we have Charles Musgrove. Well, the child's going on so well. He wished so much to be introduced to Captain Wentworth. Maybe he could join them. Mary says, oh, no, Charles, like, indeed, what if something should happen? So they're both like, okay, we're not going to go. The child had a good night. Nothing to increase alarm, but it must be a work of time to ascertain that no harm had been done to the spine.
Yep.
So then the part that you pointed out.
Got ahead of the game.
And the very interesting question you raised about what does Jane Austen actually believe about this statement, which we don't know, but certainly to me, it seems like there's this level of disapproval there and of skepticism.
Yeah.
And then Mary.
I feel like Mary reminds me so much of Mrs. Bennet from
Mary's like a young Mrs. Bennet.
Yes. Always going on about her nerves.
Yes.
And
well, this line is so awful and classic. So here he is to go away and enjoy himself. And because I am the poor mother, I am not to be allowed to stir. And yet I am sure I am more unfit than anybody else to be around the child. Oh my gosh. My being the mother is the very reason why my feelings should not be tried.
Oh my gosh.
I am not at all equal to it. You saw how hysterical I was yesterday.
Oh my gosh, trying to manipulate the situation.
Yes. So it is really interesting. I think that Austen has always had this really keen sense of like sarcasm towards unfit parents. And we see that in Pride and Prejudice, of course. That's like a major plot point.
Yes, yeah.
We see it in Sense and Sensibility. It's in Northanger Abbey too. Mansfield Park. I mean, it is like a really prevalent theme. But you're right that it's never been so centered as like as with young children,
Yes.
and the source
Not
of the
like
action,
adult children.
not like with the Bennetts.
Yes.
in
Where they're like
Pride and
all
Prejudice.
grown up.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's
Well.
a matter of debate
Yes.
whether poor Lydia's grown up.
Yeah.
But
well, she's out in society, so
yes,
I guess that
she's out. Yes,
she's out.
That's true. That's a good point. So,
and I think maybe she uses it to show other aspects of Anne, because Anne's the one who really steps up for the kids.
Well, and what's interesting about that too is that Anne is the only Austen heroine who could have kids this age of her own, you know? And so Anne is like in this parenting role, not by being the natural parent, but by being a natural parent, you know?
Okay, yes. Mm-hmm.
But I think too that children are such a, like parenting young children is such a locus point of like, what does affection look like? You know, what does care look like? Attentive care. And so we're seeing just another angle of that, and how Anne has that in her. But how she's not receiving that from anybody.
No. And she didn't really have an example.
No.
So that's why it's like, it's naturally coming from her.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is, I have never actually thought about how interestingly child-centric these chapters are.
It's because, I just remember also I watched a lot of movies recently of Jane Austen, and I don't remember seeing really kids.
No. Oh, she's not very interested in them. Okay. So then we have this really sad line where Anne stays with little Charles. And
she misses out on seeing Captain Wentworth.
Yes, she's trying to justify it in her heart.
Yeah.
And like, if you listen to the last episode, John and I talked a lot about Anne's usefulness and how that's something that she finds really important in herself, and how she justifies herself with other people. And here it is again here, where she knew herself to be of the first utility to the child. And what was it to her if Frederick Wentworth were only half a mile distant, making himself agreeable to others?
Aww.
No, it's really sad. It's really sad. Yeah.
Well, I feel like Anne still holds on to a lot of guilt for the way she rejected him, even though this was it's been eight years. I think in today's world, we think 8 years, get over it, right? Like, time has passed, you should have moved on. But in this time period, there's not a lot to do, I think, or new people to meet to quote unquote get over it. She didn't meet anyone else.
No, and even if she had, she did really, because Charles Musgrove proposed
that's
to her,
right.
But he was nothing to compare to Wentworth. Yeah, it is a long time, and and that is something that this book really hinges on, is what's the value of that time that's passed. And I think we're unclear about that at this point. It all just feels really bitter.
Yes.
It all feels melancholy. But I do think that as we stick with that idea of what is this value of time past, we'll see how time matters in judgment, like how people change, how their judgment changes.
Totally.
And how Anne has gotten to places in her judgment that she definitely wasn't there before. And Wentworth as well, though we won't see that for a while, I don't think. But
I guess when you think of ourselves at 19 and then ourselves at 27, it's a very different picture. So
yes,
that all makes sense.
Yes. Well, Wentworth. Here we are.
Here we go.
What did you think of this scene?
So I really feel for Anne. I'm just so sad for her.
Yes.
That I'm sad that he's so, when they finally meet. Is that what we're talking about, right?
Yes. At first, it's a very awkward moment.
It was very awkward, quick.
Very quick.
Very quick, very barely like acquaintance,
And
no
speaking
warmth.
of time, this is a really interesting, weird moment in contrast with the like heaviness of the 8 years, because so in my edition, it's in chapter. Are we still no? Are we in the first chapter still?
Still in 7?
Yeah, this is in 7, and so it's towards the very end of this chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And the description of how they meet is so you would think of like if this were made into a movie, well, it has been made into a movie, but if we were imagining 2 people meeting who haven't seen each other for 8 years, who were very much in love and had a tragic romance broken apart by her family and by her own judgment and being persuaded, you'd think that they would describe it and film it and portray it as like lingering glances and conveying that like tension that way. But instead, Austen gives us this scene of just like flutter and bustle, and it was a minute's work. And she repeats minute over and over and moment. And language like rushed and it would soon be over. It was soon over. She says that 5 times, some variation of that in this section, where we can just see that it's not a romantic moment at all. It's very horribly uncomfortable.
Yes.
And it really, the quickness of it and the rushed nature of it contrasts with the weight of all this history that's behind them.
That is so true. I love how you described the movie scene, because we would, make this last longer. Like you said, we would feel every moment of it.
Yes.
And then like there's, in the book, you're right, it's a minute, it's quick, it's done, she's over with.
I mean, this paragraph is too long for me probably to read out loud in this moment, but go back to it in your book and read it, because it is very odd. There's like a zillion dashes in it. So it's just like this
action.
Going back and forth. Like he said a word to Mary, a bow, a curtsy passed. It would soon be over. It was only a few minutes. So it is really, I think that conveys a different form of sadness in that, this rushed non-attention.
Yeah, like it almost didn't get any attention.
No, it might as well have been nothing.
Yeah, might as well just walk.
And that was basically what Anne was saying with it was over. It was soon over.
Yeah.
It was over. That was it.
That's it. We're done.
We're done.
Everything she's been stressing about.
And then that is, then immediately after that is when she focuses on this 8 years. So the contrast between those two is so striking and really devastating.
Yeah.
What might not 8 years do? Events of every description, changes, alienations, removals, all must be comprised in it. An oblivion of the past. How natural. How certain too. It included nearly a third part of her own life. Alas, with all her reasonings, she found that to retentive feelings, 8 years may be little more than nothing. And of course, she's talking about herself and how to see him has just devastated her. And she can't, it's like nothing has changed.
And describing something as a third of your life is pretty significant.
Yeah.
As a math person, I should know. I'm just kidding.
a
big
third
fraction
of your life.
33.3% of your life.
And then we have this horrible line, probably one of Captain Wentworth's more damning moments in the book, that really affects Anne, where Mary, of course, always the bearer of good news,
the oblivious one of anyone else around her.
Captain Wentworth is not very gallant by you, Anne, though he was so attentive to me. Gosh. Henrietta asked him what he thought of you when they went away, and he said, "You were so altered. He should not have known you again."
Ouch. Oh, I had to write that quote down too. It hurt my heart. Like, I can't imagine hearing that someone say that about yourself, that you cared for so long.
No, that you've loved for 8 years.
Mm-hmm. And was she really that altered? Can someone was she that sad or depressed that she looks so different 8 years later? I mean, naturally she's not 19, however, but.
Yeah. And I think that's something that in this moment, we don't know. In this moment, Anne's impression is mortification. And she knows that as her very kind father was pointing out, that her bloom had left, right?
Yeah.
So she's aware of that, as it says, altered beyond his knowledge, and fully submitted in silent, deep mortification. Doubtless it was so, and she could take no revenge, for he was not altered, or not for the worse. So
could you imagine also like Mary, her sister, right? Your sister loves and cares for you, and you have a sister, I have sisters, you want to protect them, right? But her sister just throws this comment out there.
And it's just so indicative of the Elliot family and the way that they treat Anne, where again, Anne is not a person with feelings.
No.
She is if she's with Mary, she is of utility, which is better than being nothing, which is what she is with Elizabeth and Sir Walter. And again, we have this theme, he should not have known you again, where Anne isn't known by anybody, and even Wentworth, who knew her, knew her. It's like a repudiation of that. And
how do you make the connection with the known? Wow, what a theme!
It's a major theme
to really know someone, and like you said, no one really knows Anne.
No, and this is a blow because Wentworth
was the one
who knew her, who recognized her for the gem that she was and is, but he's not seeing it right now.
Wow.
Ugh. But then it says those words partially come out of him not forgiving her.
Yes. Also, I'm like, you're still again holding on to resentment for 8 years after you've gone and done. I mean, we'll see later, but he's gone and done all his travels and life experiences, and still it's very hurt. And
he said, this is like a little glimpse into his mind at the very end of chapter 7 that we see, where he hadn't forgiven her. She'd used him ill, deserted and disappointed him. Worse, she had shown feebleness of character in doing so. She had given up to oblige others. It had been the effect of over persuasion. So we have ding, 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 persuasion, but he's not even putting it in this category of like persuasion, like rightful persuasion. It's over persuasion, which is actually a super weird phrase. Like, what would you think over persuasion would be?
Because if you persuade someone to do something, but do it over persuasion,
isn't it? Like it's an intensifier of something that is already an intense thing.
Yeah. Because, I don't know.
I find that phrase really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that it might be indicative of Wentworth having gone too far in the other direction, like seeing no room for persuasion of any kind. Because part of, I think, the journey of this book is that persuasion can be a very good thing as well as a bad thing.
Definitely.
But he now, because of his bitterness, his inability to forgive her, he's seen basically all forms of negative communication, of persuasive communication as like, oh, that just means they're weak or they can't make up their mind on their own, you know?
Yeah.
That's how I'm kind of reading that phrase, over persuasion, as a little like glimpse into how he's feeling about persuasive talk.
Yeah, when you describe it that way too, it just sounds like he's lost all respect for her.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he thinks he has, at least.
Yeah.
We'll see. Okay, so chapter 8.
Oh,
what are your thoughts?
Doesn't he describe the girl he's looking for?
Yes, he does. You had pointed that out when we were talking about this earlier.
He describes who was asking him, who was he looking for in a wife?
His sister.
His sister was
Mrs. Croft.
Yes.
The fascinating Mrs. Croft, who I wish appeared more in this book.
So they know he's young and single, so obviously he's looking for a wife, because that's all they do in those times. Just kidding. So when she asked him what he's looking for, some of the things he said was a strong mind with sweetness of manner. And I just felt like none of it was physical. It was all on the inside. And I just felt like he's describing Anne, but he just doesn't realize maybe he's describing Anne.
He doesn't think he is. He's saying accepting Anne Elliot. This was his only secret exception.
Mhm.
But you're right. It actually is a pretty dead-on description of Anne Elliot. For sure.
Yeah. So
did you have any other thoughts on that chapter before we go on to chapter 8?
now let's get on to chapter 8.
Okay. Chapter 8. Oh, this is a sad beginning too. They're in the same circle. They're dining in company together, and it's just awkward and sad meeting after awkward and sad meeting.
Mhm.
All on Anne's end. We don't see it on his end. He's very merry. He's
With
dancing with
everybody
the
else.
ladies. He's flirting with Henrietta and
Yep.
Louisa.
Yeah, he's being the man of the hour.
He is. He's the belle of the ball.
Yes. It's the shiny new toy.
Yeah. He is. And this line kills me. This line, I think, is such a tragic line. And Anne is reminiscing about how she and Wentworth were in the past when they were engaged. She says, with the exception perhaps of Admiral and Mrs. Croft, who seemed particularly attached and happy, Anne could allow no other exception, even among the married couples, there could have been no two hearts so open, no tastes so similar, no feelings so in unison, no countenances so beloved. Now they were as strangers, nay, worse than strangers, for they could never become acquainted. It was a perpetual estrangement.
Ugh.
And this idea of never even being able to become acquainted
Yep.
is so sad.
It is.
I don't even know what
I
else to
think
say
there's a
about
level
that.
of civility with being an acquaintance.
Yes.
And it's just gone past that.
Yes. Worse than strangers.
Worse.
Because
Yes.
strangers, you don't have to be affected by the way that they treat you, see you, or don't see you.
Yeah.
Um,
But you'll be polite and you'll engage in small talk with a stranger if you
Yes.
need to.
mhm.
But you're right. You don't care. Maybe it's bye, never see you again. Or
Yeah. Or you see a random person, on a walk or whatever, and that's it. You just go about your day.
Yeah.
There's no influence. There's no
Mhm.
effect. And this is the opposite of that, basically.
I just get more and more sad for Anne.
I know. It is. The way that Austen describes these moments, it is difficult at times to sit in.
Yeah, I think one way I can think about it is like if I had a best friend for 8 years and then all of a sudden we stopped talking. And then, because, you know each other the best as your best friend, whether it's your husband or male best friend. And then seeing that person 8 years later and not even engage in a small talk conversation with them as an acquaintance, like, ouch, that's really, you're kind of going out of your way to hurt that person, I feel like.
Oh, I definitely think Wentworth he's not being uncivil, but he is being cold with great intentionality.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it.
I mean, it's a very directed coldness,
Mm-hmm.
and Anne is suffering under that. So we have the Miss Musgroves just oohing and awing over him.
Mm-hmm.
They get out their Navy list. They all look at it together. And by the way, that's something that I meant to look at before this this talk, is that I was like, what would a Navy list actually look like?
Yeah.
Like, is it literally a list on paper, or is it like a book? Because at times it sounds like it's kind of a book.
Yeah.
Like, are
kind
there
of like
pictures?
The list of nobility, a list of Navy officers.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
that kind of thing.
That is an interesting connection. I hadn't thought of that. Like the baronetage that we begin with. Where it's but it's very different than that, because it's like there are things coming in and out of it all the time. And but I didn't look it up. So if any of you listeners know anything about the British Navy list from the early 19th century, I would be very interested to know. And maybe I just need to do some Wikipedia hunting.
Wikipedia.
Wikipedia, my wormhole favorite.
So I was really enjoyed when Mrs. Croft came on the scene.
Yes.
when she was describing kind of how she joined her husband on the ships and would go on all these like different places around the world with him. And that was after, I forgot who was saying like women shouldn't be on ships. Wentworth
was saying like he only brought his friend Harville's family on the ship because Harville asked him to. So it was only a favor for a beloved friend and fellow officer. But he said, I would never have done it otherwise.
Yeah. He's like, women don't belong there. And she's like, I did it. And it was great. And I thought, again, I kind of saw another kind of gender specific situation where this guy's like, no, only men can do this. And here's a female character who's like, no, I can do this too. And I'm a woman.
Yes.
So that brought me to a question that I've been wondering for a while is Jane Austen a feminist?
Ooh, this is a really good question.
I don't know if feminism was a thing at her time.
Right. So it wouldn't be like feminism as we know it today, as the movement of feminism.
But kind of questioning gender roles and where women kind of lie in that.
Belonged and didn't belong.
Yes.
What would, before I share my thoughts on that, what are your thoughts as you ask that question?
Well, when I look at her life as an independent, self-sufficient woman, I kind of feel like she is supportive of women being independent or women taking on work or careers or making choices that are not just getting married. And so I see that as kind of like a feminist thing, I guess, in a way where she's saying women and men can both make their way in life. Kind of.
Yeah. I think that I think this is, so last week, if you guys remember, John and I talked a lot about class in her novels and how she's kind of conflicted at points. And I feel like Jane Austen and gender is another point where there's this really interesting conflict going on, where she is a traditional thinker, I think, in regards to like really valuing say like character. She wanted the character of the gentry to fit this like old expansive ideal, and it wouldn't. And then so she changes her mind and decides that's not a good model anymore. But that's what she had wanted. That's where her impulses of writing and her ideas about how people in the upper classes should act, they were grounded in what would have been a more old-fashioned idea.
Very true. Yeah.
And so I feel like this might be a similar kind of moment where she has these ideas for women, where she's written book after book where women marry happily. It's not marriages of duty. It's not marriages.
It's a choice.
It's a choice. They are, a lot of them are empowered in their own time and place and way. But they're still ending with this more traditional setup, like Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy.
Yes.
It's a very good marriage. It's not just like a love match. It's also a very good, like socially good marriage.
Yes. All the positives.
Yes. And that's why I think this is really, I think you've hit on something that is a fascinating little moment of tension, where we see Wentworth articulating something that Mrs. Croft, who is a different kind of woman, and who, by the way, is a model for Anne, because Anne, again, sorry, spoiler alert, but Anne will become a Navy wife, fingers crossed if all works out with Wentworth, which it's a Jane Austen novel.
So it's a rom-com.
Yeah. But so she is this model of a marriage, model of she's better at some things than her husband is. And some things that are traditionally male things, like handling money, Mrs. Croft does that in their relationship. So there is this changing model and this changing idea of where's a woman's place? Where's Anne's place? Where do women belong?
Yeah.
And we're seeing this expansion of that idea. It's not just in a manor house anymore.
That's true.
And Wentworth is wrong about it here.
Yes.
As I think Austen makes clear in the way that she writes Mrs. Croft's response to it.
Yes. Yeah, he sounds so stubborn and she sounds so wise.
Yes, where we can tell he's responding out of being burnt off of Anne.
Yeah.
And she's responding out of her true love and desire to be with her husband.
Yes.
So their motivations are so different there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I
think,
really like Mrs. Cross.
Yeah,
Croft.
I know. She's great. I think that, we can't say, yes, Jane Austen is a feminist.
Yeah.
But what we can say is Jane Austen is asking the question, where do women belong? What are women's roles? What can they do? What is good for women to do? And she's broadening answers to that question in this book.
Yep.
In my opinion.
Definitely. Yeah. I wonder if she writes this as she's thinking about it, or has like an idea in her head about it. Because sometimes I think you write a story and you explore an idea as you're writing, right?
Well, we know that, so Persuasion was Austen's last novel, which we've talked about. And it's not, so a lot of her earlier novels, she wrote in her early 20s. It's like Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, a couple of the others. And then didn't publish them for like a decade at least. So revised them heavily and then eventually published them. Persuasion and Mansfield Park, I believe it's Mansfield Park, but I could be wrong. I don't have that book right in front of me. Those were written and then published like in fairly quick succession. And this was later in her life. So I do think these are things that she's processing and thinking through that are different than when she was 21.
Definitely. Yeah. And in Mansfield Park, she's a very strong female character.
Mansfield Park is fascinating. Maybe we should do that another time.
Yes, because I've only seen the movie.
Yes.
So.
Oh, the movie's not very good either, honestly. Well, the BBC adaptation is okay, but okay. So did you have anything to add? We have that interesting scene. Their different motivations and how they answer.
Yeah, I have one thought where I just don't. How does no one realize that they don't even talk or look at each other? Like, don't they know that they had met before previously?
They don't.
Oh,
actually.
They don't.
No.
I thought Mary at least knew that.
Well, Mary is so self-absorbed.
Very self-absorbed. Charles would have known that, but no one else knows that they had met previously.
No, Charles doesn't know. So, in the last section, I think, is when it talks about how Anne is relieved that no one probably knows because her father was too proud to mention it. Okay. And Lady Russell didn't bring it up out of delicacy.
I see. So no one knows.
No one knew that they were engaged.
But so I would think it's weird if I saw two people in a group that just never like avoided each other like the plague.
For sure it's weird.
Like, why does no one pick up on that?
Well, because it's Anne. Like, it's another one of those moments, where it's like Anne is there playing the piano for other people to dance.
Yes.
Anne is taking care of the sick kid.
Yes.
Anne is not calling attention to herself in any way. But so more so people aren't
out of character
attending to her. Yeah.
That's very true. I have two very sad quotes from Anne.
Oh no. More sad quotes.
More sad quotes.
This is the section of sad quotes.
Yeah. So you mentioned she's playing the music for all of them so they can dance and she's just playing the music.
Where is this, by the way?
It's
which chapter?
It's chapter 8.
It's chapter 8.
Yes.
Oh, there it is. Oh, here it is. Oh, I know which one it is. Okay, read it.
So Anne's playing the music and it says, though her eyes would sometimes fill with tears as she sat with the instrument, she was extremely glad to be employed and desired nothing in return but to be unobserved. That broke my heart that she's sitting here playing music so her love could dance with someone else and she's crying.
Yes. And that's so, that last little phrase, desired nothing in return but to be unobserved. There is a deep sadness in that idea, for one thing, that's the height of your ambition in company with other people.
It's just, don't observe me. Don't look at me.
But also I think that one of the transformations of Anne that we're going to see is Anne learning how to be observed. Like, I'm not going to say it right now because we'll wait till later. But something to flag as you keep reading is Anne learning how to be observed and not just hoping to be like utilized in the background.
Not just to be useful.
Yes.
And there's another sad quote.
Oh no.
Following that. So she's still playing the music for them. And she says, once she felt that he was looking at herself, observing her altered features, perhaps trying to trace in them the ruins of her face, which had once charmed him. The ruins of her face.
It's like she's that phrase always makes, whenever I've read this paragraph, it makes me think of like a crumbled like castle in England, like of this trying to figure out where each room was and wandering among these ruins and knowing the past and the history that were there, but there's
no
nothing
longer
there but these just crumbled pieces. And it is not a flattering picture of Anne's face.
No, we haven't had any flattering things of her face yet.
No.
And that's all I have for chapter 8. It's just sadness.
And chapter 8 ends with, again, that theme of like, worse than being unknown is complete coldness and lack of openness, lack of sincerity. Their only interaction is Wentworth saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, this is your seat," and like withdrawing.
Yep.
And the chapter ends with, Anne did not wish for more of such looks and speeches. His cold politeness, his ceremonious grace were worse than anything.
Ugh.
So on to chapter 9.
Let's keep going.
Wentworth's at Uppercross every day. Everyone is obsessed with him. Except for poor Charles Hayter.
Oh yeah, Charles.
And like, okay, I want to know, is Jane Austen doing like kind of a silly pun that his last name is Hayter?
Oh my gosh. It's like your Richard and Dick thing earlier.
No, but is it like Charles Hayter, like really his strongest character feature? Like he's this nice young man, but his strongest character feature in this section is that he doesn't like Captain Wentworth because he's in love with Henrietta.
Yes.
It's very, it's a bummer.
Yeah, definitely.
As so much as
poor Charles.
Poor Mr. Hayter.
I feel like Jane Austen loves a love triangle.
Oh, she does. She definitely does. And what is funny in this bit is Charles and Mary Musgrove arguing over who Wentworth prefers.
Oh, yes.
And arguing over how good of a match Charles Hayter is.
Mm-hmm.
And this line from Mary is Mary's convinced that Wentworth likes Henrietta better, who supposedly had this thing with Charles Hayter, but Mary's mad about that. So she's convinced that it's Henrietta and Wentworth. And Charles is convinced that it is Louisa.
Yep.
And Mary says, Charles may say what he pleases, cried Mary to Anne as soon as he was out of the room, but it would be shocking to have Henrietta marry Charles Hayter. A very bad thing for her, and still worse for me.
Back to Mary. It's all about Mary.
It's just a classic Mary moment where she doesn't, like, what we've seen is that Charles Hayter and Henrietta did have some kind of affection, like a real affection for each other, especially on his end. And but the only thing Mary can see is that he is like slightly less important than the Musgroves and then Wentworth. And so she sees it as this degrading alliance. And so she's just an Elliot. It's such an Elliot move.
Yes.
It's ridiculous.
But yeah, I love how Jane Austen writes love triangles. You know, she's always trying to mix it up there.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like Elizabeth and Wickham and Lydia and Darcy, like they all kind of overlapped and mixed together.
Mm-hmm.
And then Emma with something bad with the names. I just saw this movie recently. She and Churchill.
Frank Churchill.
And then
yes.
Jane Fairfax.
Yes.
Yeah. And then
and
Emma with
Elton.
Oh,
he's a horrible character.
And
Speaking of horrible characters.
Yeah.
He's so obnoxious.
Yeah. There's always something. There's always someone. There's like 3 or 4 people all mixed up with their feelings together.
Yeah. Well, so much of Austen's action comes from like these little delicate situations where it's like the slightest word, the slightest little tip. And if you aren't reading the room correctly, like Anne is basically the reverse of Emma. Because the joke of Emma is that Emma never reads the room correctly, ever. Emma thinks Elton is in love with Harriet.
Mm-hmm.
Emma thinks that
Churchill
is in love with her.
Yeah.
Emma thinks that Jane Fairfax is a cold, heartless, bad person. Emma doesn't understand that she's actually in love with Mr. Knightley.
Yes. Oh, and she also thinks Mr. Knightley likes Harriet.
Yes.
Yep.
So we have this, Emma is constantly not reading the room, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And Anne is like caught in reading the room. Yeah. And she keeps, there's actually the language of reading, which I noted, but didn't have a section to show you. But if you watch, you see Anne constantly trying to read Wentworth. She's trying to read his feelings.
Oh, yeah.
And finding it very difficult / just generally discouraging.
Yeah, she's just there like constantly making observations of the room. Mm-hmm. And it's so funny you say it's the opposite of Emma. And I started reading this and thinking in this chapter, who does Jane Austen, what character does she relate to the most? Because she writes all about observations of society and relationships and gender roles. So I wonder if she sees a part of herself in Anne of being in the room and observing the people around her.
That's a
collecting
good
stories. Or
I mean, on one hand, it's unanswerable, right? Because
totally.
It's like, she'd have to tell us herself who she relates to the most. But from our outside perspective, I do feel like, Anne Elliot is a really interesting potential representation for Jane herself. This person who is always observing, and especially since Austen didn't receive the fame that she so justly has today during her own lifetime. She certainly was receiving accolades, but she died virtually penniless at a young age and hadn't lived to see this immense popularity of her books and had potentially unrequited love relationships that had affected her. We don't know that for sure, how deeply those go. There's so much speculation. There's so much speculation. But definitely, we know that is a possibility for her life. And so I think Anne is a good contender for that. Or the other option.
Maybe just like one side of her personality.
Yes. When she was known, like Anne, to be often quiet in company and then very witty, very observant and wise in what she was seeing in other people. How could she not be? You can tell when you read her book. She's got this keen eye for human nature. So, I don't know. What do you think?
But I also think she would relate to Elizabeth Bennet.
Yes.
Strongly.
Yes.
So I kind of, maybe she has different aspects of her personality in the different characters.
And maybe I think too, I could see her, she writes Eleanor Dashwood so sympathetically in Sense and Sensibility.
It's true.
And a lot of critics write that they think that Fanny in Mansfield Park is a semi-autobiographical character, which is really
interesting.
But I haven't read very much about that claim, so I can't speak to that. But I know that that's a claim that's floating out there in the world. So Henrietta Louisa, we don't know. And then we have this, again, fascinating moment with a child at the center of things. This is what ends
Mhm.
chapter 9.
Yeah.
And it's very strange. And this was something I wanted to ask you about. What you thought of this scene where Anne is struggling with the younger child, the uninjured child, Walter. He's like clambered up on her back. He's being a huge pain.
Yep. She's saying
he's not obeying her, not listening to her. And Charles Hayter is there being semi-useless as usual. Yep. Bless him. He's saying, obey your cousin. I am your cousin. It's like, oh, have you ever met a 2-year-old? Have you ever met a 2-year-old Charles Hayter?
Yeah.
You clearly haven't. And Wentworth goes and he's in this close physical proximity to Anne. He uncurls the child's fingers from around her neck and carries the child away. And Anne is like rattled. She is deeply touched by this. She has to take a moment to calm herself. She's nervous and overcome. And why do you think that this moment there's so much time spent describing this moment?
You're right.
It's such a major moment, and it's something so small, so delicate.
Kind of like they say, actions speak louder than words.
Mm-hmm.
So just describe the action clearly to kind of emphasize the importance of it. And when you're describing this just now, it made me think it's like a hint of kindness that he's finally showing her, like melting, thawing. Or thawing. Maybe the coldness will leave soon, or there's a glimmer of hope that maybe they can at least be acquaintances or something. And I just liked the quote where it says, for Anne, after he removed the child, her sensations on the discovery made her perfectly speechless.
Yes.
What do you think?
I think that you're definitely right, where it's a moment of kindness and of thawing that makes this powerful impression. I also think that it is somebody attending to Anne instead of Anne attending to other people.
Yes.
And no one has done that yet.
Yes, you're so right.
And so it's Anne in visible irritation and distress, even though it's really small. It's just a child being annoying.
Yeah, being a child.
But the fact that it's so small even makes it maybe more impactful. It's not like Anne sprained her ankle while on a walk and he had to carry her home in the rain, like Mary Ann, where it's this like
dramatic
emotional moment of aid.
Yeah.
It's such a small act of kindness, but it betrays this minute attention that he's trying to basically block, but that it's there.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Someone attending to her and helping her, like a true partnership.
Yes. Well, I think that's kind of part of the whole question of this book is like, what does a true partnership look like? And that's why I think the Crofts are always like popping up in the background.
Yeah.
Because they're true partners.
Yeah. They're like equals in the relationship.
They are, which is really weird, really shocking for a marriage
this
of that
time.
period.
Yeah. Yeah, but what a way to end.
Exactly. So
like a glimmer of hope.
A glimmer of hope. But also very painful and agitating. That's the language used to describe it. Yes. But yeah, something is thawing. So that's the end of chapter 9.
And that's chapter 9.
Well, Marisa,
wow, we did it.
We did it. Thank you for coming.
Oh, this is
Thank
so
you
fun.
for being here with me in person.
Yes, I'm so glad we could do this in person.
Me too.
As I'm staring into your beautiful blue eyes.
Oh, thank you. And next week we'll do chapters 10 through 12, volume 1. So be sure to check those out. And here I have to give my boring, stupid spiel about make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and subscribe to the podcast and the blog. one of any of those, but more so with more feeling, even though please do those things. I would love it if you did.
Absolutely.
But with even more feeling, I'd like to add, if you have thoughts, questions, ideas, I would love to hear them, and love to add them to the conversation, to the Summer Old Book Club. And you can email any of those ideas or questions at oldbookswithgrace@gmail.com, or alternatively, you can comment them on the YouTube video. Or alternatively, again, I have an Instagram account, and you can follow it on Instagram, Old Books with Grace, with what are those understores with underscores in between the words. So there you go.
There you go. I actually thought the questions you posted last time were very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Yes,
Shout out to Chelsea Fisk Swanson, who is actually our upcoming guest, who answered them on the Instagram, and I deeply appreciated that.
Hey, Chelsea.
But thank you so much for joining me and Marissa, and I hope that you enjoyed it, and I look forward to next week. So,
bye.